May 1945. Northern Germany. The war was ending not with glory, but with chaos. As British forces pushed through Hamburg toward the Baltic, they encountered something unexpected among the surrendering Wehrmacht units. Thousands of young women in uniform. Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, female auxiliaries who'd operated radar stations, manned anti-aircraft batteries, decoded signals. Most were between 18 and 25. All were terrified. Greta Hoffmann was 22, a signals auxiliary from Dresden. She'd spent 3 years monitoring radio frequencies for the Luftwaffe, sitting in bunkers with headphones pressed to her ears while bombers flew overhead. When the British arrived at her station near Lübeck, she expected the worst. The propaganda had been clear. British soldiers were animals who'd shown no mercy to women in uniform. Instead, a British corporal offered her a cigarette and asked, in broken German, if she needed medical attention. That small gesture would change everything she had thought she knew about defeat. Talking about down there is our subscribe button. If you're interested in untold stories like this, hit it. The Wehrmacht-Helferinnen weren't soldiers, technically. Nazi ideology insisted women belonged at home, bearing children for the Reich. But total war demanded total mobilization. By 1943, with German men dying by the hundreds of thousands on the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht had no choice. They recruited women, half volunteers, half conscripts, for auxiliary roles, communications, radar operation, anti-aircraft defense, meteorology, administration. By 1945, 500,000 German women served in these capacities. 1 in every 20 people in Wehrmacht uniform was female, though the regime never acknowledged them as soldiers. They worked in occupied France, Poland, Greece. They operated flak batteries in Berlin as Allied bombs fell. They decoded messages in bunkers beneath burning cities. And when Germany collapsed in spring 1945, they surrendered alongside the men. The British didn't know what to do with them at first. Female prisoners of war were a novelty. There were precedents: Soviet women soldiers captured on the Eastern Front, nurses taken in North Africa, but nothing on this scale. Thousands of German women auxiliaries fell into British hands in the final weeks of the war. The initial processing happened in Belgium. Camps near Brussels housed SS women, Luftwaffe auxiliaries, civilian prisoners, all sorted and documented according to Geneva Convention protocols that hadn't really anticipated this situation. Greta Hoffmann remembered the camp at Villevoorde, just outside Brussels: tents, barbed wire, guards with rifles. But also Red Cross parcels, medical examinations, forms to fill out in triplicate. The bureaucracy of captivity felt almost surreal after the chaos of collapse. "We expected brutality," she'd later write. "What we got was procedure." The transfer to Britain began in summer 1945. The camps in Belgium were harsh, overcrowded, undersupplied, designed for temporary holding. British authorities, already managing hundreds of thousands of male German POWs, decided to bring the women across the Channel. The journey north through a continent in ruins was its own education. German cities had become moonscapes of rubble. But as they crossed into France, then boarded ships for England, the women saw something that shattered their understanding. Nations that had fought Germany for 6 years, yet remained intact. No bomb craters in the English countryside, farms with livestock, villages with windows, children playing. The contrast with Germany was devastating. They arrived at camps scattered across Britain, converted textile mills, requisitioned manor houses, purpose-built compounds with Nissen huts and guard towers. The largest concentration was in the north: Lancashire, Yorkshire, the Midlands, far from population centres and potential escape routes. The camp near Manchester, where Greta was sent, had once manufactured cotton. Now it housed 62 German women in a space designed for industrial machinery. Cold, drafty, but structurally sound, with real bunks, actual latrines, a kitchen that produced hot meals. The first weeks were about establishing routine: roll call at 8 a.m., work assignments, repairing uniforms, peeling potatoes, sorting supplies, meals at fixed times, lights out at 10. The predictability was jarring after years of war's chaos, but also oddly comforting. What surprised Greta most was the absence of cruelty. Guards who were firm but not vicious. Rules enforced without brutality. Medical care when women fell ill. Letters permitted though censored. The Geneva Convention wasn't just paperwork, it was being followed. We'd been told the British were savage, she wrote home to her mother in August 1945. They're not, they're just tired. Everyone is tired. If you're still watching, you're clearly a history lover. Hit that subscribe button. The turning point came gradually through small interactions that accumulated into something larger. A guard named Davies who showed photographs of his daughter. A camp cook who saved vegetable scraps for a woman trying to grow herbs in a window box. A chaplain who held services without proselytizing. Christmas 1945 brought an unexpected moment. No official celebration, Germany had lost after all. But on Christmas Eve, Sergeant Rees appeared with a cart of hot cider and shortbread biscuits. For wine, he said in broken German, mangling the pronunciation of Weihnachten. Someone began singing Stille Nacht, softly at first, then louder. The guards didn't stop them. Captain Thornhill, the camp commandant, stood in the doorway and removed his cap. 19-year-old Laisel clutched her cup of warm cider and whispered, "Are we still prisoners?" Her friend Elsa looked at the guards, then back. "Yes, but we're also guests." The distinction mattered more than either of them realized. Work assignments expanded. Women were sent to local farms for potato harvesting, supervised by elderly guards who shared tobacco and talked about sons lost in the war. They repaired damaged textiles in workshops. They cleared bomb rubble in cities that had been hit by the same Luftwaffe that employed them. The British public's reaction was complex. Some locals remained hostile. These were enemy women, after all, from a regime that had bombed their cities and killed their sons. But others showed unexpected kindness. A farmer's wife in Yorkshire brought sandwiches to women working in her fields. A shopkeeper in Lancashire hired Greta to help with inventory, paying her in chocolate and soap. By early 1946, the camps began emptying. Repatriation was starting. Women were being sent back to occupied Germany, to cities that existed mostly as rubble, to families scattered or dead, to a country divided and devastated. Greta received her repatriation notice in March 1946. Her hands trembled as she read it. Return to Dresden, the city where she'd grown up. Except Dresden was gone, destroyed in the February 1945 firestorm that killed tens of thousands. She went to Captain Thornhill's office and asked, in halting English, if there was any way she could stay. Thornhill looked at her for a long moment. "Why would you want to remain a prisoner?" "Because here I'm safe. Here I can work. Here people treat me like a human being instead of whatever I'd be in Germany." Thornhill sighed. "That's not how this works. You're a prisoner of war. The war is over. You go home." "To what?" "My city is ruins. My father is dead. My mother I haven't heard from in 8 months." "What home?" And if you're enjoying this deep dive, subscribing helps us keep making stories like this. The British government faced an unexpected problem. While official policy demanded repatriation, reality was more complicated. Britain desperately needed labour, agriculture, textile manufacturing, reconstruction. Hundreds of thousands of men were still demobilizing. Women who'd worked in factories during the war were returning to domestic life. Meanwhile, German POWs, both male and female, had proven to be reliable workers, skilled, disciplined, desperate to stay busy, and increasingly, many didn't want to return to Germany. The reasons varied. Some, like Greta, had nothing to go back to. Others came from regions now under Soviet control and feared what awaited them there. A few had formed relationships with British locals, tentative, supervised, but real. In April 1946, the government introduced a scheme. German POWs could apply to have their prisoner status terminated and be reclassified as civilian workers. They'd be free to remain in Britain, take regular employment, live outside camps. It wasn't citizenship, that would take years. But it was a path forward that wasn't forced repatriation to rubble. Of the original 62 women in Greta's camp, 19 applied to stay. The process was bureaucratic and intrusive. Background checks, interviews, assessments of political reliability. Had they been ardent Nazis or just ordinary women caught up in extraordinary circumstances? Medical examinations, character references from camp commandants and local employers. Greta's application was approved in June 1946. She was released from POW status, given civilian papers, and found work at a textile mill in Manchester. The same city that had housed her as a prisoner now became her home. The transition was strange. No more roll call, no more guards, just a job, a rented room above a bakery, a life that felt almost normal despite being surrounded by people whose language she was still learning and whose country she'd fought against. The woman who ran the bakery, Mrs. Patterson, lost her son at Arnhem. She knew Greta had been German military. For the first weeks, their interactions were coldly professional. Then one morning, Mrs. Patterson brought tea to Greta's room and sat down. "My son died fighting you lot," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I'm happy about that. But you're here now, and you work hard, and you've been through hell too. So we'll figure this out." It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more practical. Recognition that the war was over and life had to continue. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. By 1948, approximately 25,000 German POWs, men and women, had chosen to remain in Britain rather than return to Germany. The figure represented a tiny fraction of the 400,000 Germans held at the war's end, but it was significant. These weren't people fleeing justice. War criminals had been prosecuted. These were ordinary individuals who'd found, in the country that defeated them, something they couldn't find at home: stability, work, the possibility of rebuilding. Greta stayed. She married in 1951. Not a romantic love story, but a practical partnership with a British factory worker named Thomas, who'd been invalided out of the army after being wounded in Italy. They didn't talk much about the war. They talked about rent, about groceries, about saving money for a house. She never fully lost her accent, never stopped being German in some fundamental way. But she became British too. Naturalized in 1954, voted in elections, sent Christmas cards to Mrs. Patterson until the old woman died in 1963. Other women from her camp scattered. Some returned to Germany and rebuilt there. Others, like Elsa, married British servicemen and settled in Surrey or Cornwall or Scotland. A few disappeared from record entirely, slipping into anonymity. What united them all was the experience of having expected brutality and received something else. Not kindness exactly. They were prisoners after all, but decency, fairness, the adherence to rules even when rules could have been ignored. The choice made daily by thousands of British guards and administrators and ordinary citizens to treat defeated enemies as humans. "I thought defeat meant the end of everything," Greta wrote in a letter to Captain Thornhill in 1965, 20 years after her capture. Instead, it meant the beginning of learning that enemies can become something other than enemies. Not friends necessarily, but people. The story of German female POWs in Britain isn't well known. It's overshadowed by larger narratives: the Holocaust, the bombing campaigns, the grand strategy of victory. But it represents something important about how wars end and how peace begins. Not with grand gestures or political declarations, but with a guard offering a cigarette, a farmer's wife bringing sandwiches, a landlady deciding that past was past and present needed handling. If this story moved you, please share it. We'll see you in the next one. Greta Hoffmann died in Manchester in 1998 at the age of 75. Her obituary in the local paper mentioned she'd been a German auxiliary during the war, captured and held as a POW, who chose to stay and build a life in Britain. At her funeral, her daughter read from a letter Greta had written but never sent. Found in her papers afterward, "I arrived in England expecting punishment for a war I hadn't wanted, but had served. What I found was a nation that had every right to be cruel and chose not to be. They didn't forgive us. We didn't deserve forgiveness. But they gave us the chance to prove we were more than what our government had made us. That chance was everything. The camps are gone now. The textile mills converted or demolished. The farms where German women picked potatoes under guard are just farms again. But the lesson remains: written in the lives of 25,000 people who might have been sent back to rubble and chose instead to stay and rebuild alongside former enemies. The war taught them to fight. Peace taught them something harder, that defeat could be survived, that enemies could show mercy, and that home could be found in the most unexpected places. The knock came at dusk that day in October 1945. But what followed wasn't vengeance. It was the beginning of understanding that war's end doesn't require victory's cruelty, and that the defeated, treated with basic dignity, could become something other than permanent enemies. Some of them stayed, not because they forgot who they were or where they came from, but because they remembered who they'd become, and Britain, exhausted and weary, let them.